we're taking a look at Era, for which I have a pretty good, I think, complete collection that they were kind enough to send me as a review copy. I entered into this with the feeling that it was a game that doesn't really suit me. And, you know, in some ways, I still hold to that, which is to say that it's a game that I think I respect less than I enjoyed. There's very little in the way of strategic thinking as far as I can see in the game. It's basically a situation where the goal in this game is, the way you get good at it is basically you familiarize yourself with the decks and start making little rules of thumb. Now, everything that I've said here, I said either in the intro or in sort of the wrap when I quit. Oh, at least I expect that'll be the case. But yeah, it's really not a game that, you know, you're tinkering a lot. You're not able to modify your decks or anything like that. You're just handed a certain deck. The attacks that you take are fixed from the certain kind of deck. So the way you get better at this game is to know how the deck that you're playing works, and maybe how the deck to some extent, how the deck your opponent is playing works. Because you make some decisions with the attack cards that the opponent's deck has that are attacking him. In terms of story and whatnot, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of story coming out in the game. Now, for me, any game that doesn't have a board and control of areas and stuff like that, it's very difficult for me to get a story out of it at all. But one where, you know, there are just these cards that, yeah, are fairly generic. I find myself each deck is different, but the cards themselves are just these representations of the symbols that they make from them. But I found the actual play of it in the two-player game to be light enough and fun enough that I could definitely see this becoming kind of an addictive type game. For not any great reason, except that once you kind of have the rules down, and start recognizing what all the symbols mean and everything. And there are a hell of a lot of them. It's not as bad as Race for the Galaxy, which, you know, is this incredibly well-regarded game that I couldn't face at all, essentially, because of the iconography in it and the amount of effort that went into that. And that's one of the interesting things I found about this one, is that a lot of what the designers sought to make, you know, not a game that has like that you're configuring decks or anything like that. You're handed a deck. There's nothing you can do to change it. There's very little you can do to modify how it plays. The only question is how you react to what it's built out of. And, you know, essentially how many cards you shove into the build deck, modified, of course, by knowledge of the opponent's deck, how many cards you want to shove in the attack deck, and also modified by the tableau, the board state, whatever. So, kind of the exploration side of the game is just figuring out how to do any given deck. And you start with 4 decks, which, you know, that's what the base game comes to, which I feel like that'll probably play out pretty quickly. But if you get all the expansions, this isn't all of them, I've got 3 more in here. If you get all the expansions, you have a lot of room for more combinations and whatnot. if that's what you're into. If you want to start, learning about these different decks and how they play against each other. And I kind of feel like that's what it's aiming for, which doesn't really impress me, right? Like, I'm not looking at it and saying, wow, that's a really clever design. So like Dominion, as an example of a game that I really enjoyed and respected, hands you a new tableau or set of cards that you get to deal with, and you have to, in real time during play, figure out every time you play how you're going, which of these cards work well together and how you want to utilize them together and how you want to build your deck, right? So that's very cool. Magic, look, Magic is about, having this huge mass of cards that you're putting together and building a deck. But this has no deck building in it. This doesn't really provide you with a hell of a lot of different experience, I think, although you can definitely be handed curveballs. So, for example, the first time I played, Plague Rats just didn't come out. Against the Crusader player. And so he didn't really have anything to limit him, and his castles just provided him with an ultimate defense, and it felt completely unbalanced. The designer pointed out a couple of things that I did wrong in that first playthrough, and also the fact that the Plague Rats just didn't have their impact. They could have a huge impact on that player. The decks do play very differently. Some of them get attacked much more heavily than others do. They all have cards that attack them, but some of them attack in different ways. And so for example, the Egyptians in the multiplayer game I played, none of their direct combat cards came out in their attacks. Instead, things that just defeated their capability to produce resources came out. And their deck is very heavy on that. Now, I completely mucked up my multiplayer game, and it has to do with me being not able to deal well with icons representing everything. And again, one of the design decisions was, let's make a game that doesn't require text on the cards, can print, can translate the rule book into different languages, but that way all the cards can always work. But what that kind of ends up meaning is that it hits my weak spot of being able to cope with that. Is this quantity of icons overwhelming? It's big to start with, but more aren't added within the decks. They're all in this initial rule book, and we went through them in the introduction. Of course, you might not get used to some of them, like how the arrows work and stuff. You might have to look those up and try to figure them out because they apply differently to different things at different times. The rulebook itself wasn't very good, in my opinion. I'm not sure it could be better because of what it's trying to do. Present this, purely icon-driven game in terms of what's on the cards. And a lot of information is being expressed using the same symbols, meaning different things depending on, how they're placed. And I found myself having to look up some of the odder cases. I also found myself forgetting stuff that was kind of core to the game. In the particular case when I played the multiplayer, look, that was painful in terms of like the amount of information I had to drink in across 4 different players, each with different types of decks. But in particular, something that I knew in the first game, which was that the extra build capabilities on the cards required a matching. It was a resource-intensive thing. This is one thing. There's nothing on the cards that shows you the differentiation between the cards that require a match, the icons that require a match, and the icons that don't. It has a lot to do with when they take effect. The things that happen during the resource gathering phase require matches. But I fucked up and didn't notice that the extra build phase ones were that, or didn't remember it is more the case, because I was flustered with the amount of stuff that I was having to cope with in the 4-player game, and the multiplayer rules, which are a little different. Some of them add things that I don't know are necessary. In particular, there's these multiplayer bonus cards, which to me feel like they're more of an optional rule that could be applied to either game, rather than a key component that is necessary for the multiplayer game. Now, maybe there was some reason that they're absolutely locked into the multiplayer game that I'm just not seeing. My, 1.5 plays, neither one perfect, isn't at all sufficient to be able to say with any authority that that's the case. But it does feel a little weird, and I would, the kind of person who says, hey, let's play Cosmic Encounter with 3 powers per player and 1.5 times the number of flares in the deck, as we used to play it, and we liked it, is going, not something to play solitaire either. Is going to maybe have a higher tolerance than how this was tested out. This game existed as an idea for a long time. It took a long time for the Kickstarter to come out. There was a bunch of drama about that, whatever. I don't really want to dig too much into it. I saw what was going on, and I'm like, that's a shame. And it just, I'm the person who can't cope with Kickstarters. I've tried a couple of them. Even one that went perfectly really stressed me out too much, and no others that I dealt with went as well. Well, I guess I kind of did 2 real ones, but anyway, it just doesn't please me, and I kind of have to respect. I don't know what the decision making and the reasons why it was held off so long. I think it had to do more with finances and publishing and stuff like that than refining the game. But I definitely respect a decision of, the game's not working quite the way I wanted it to. We're going to delay it, even though I had it at, final play tests and everything. We need to tweak things and fix things. But anyway, the multiplayer game is much, much heavier than the 2-player game. Certainly solitaire. But I think even just sitting down and playing it. In 4 players, you've got a lot that you've got to cope with, and you've got to assess about the situation. You've got to understand 3 other players' decks and how they're liable to work, as well as the one that you're playing. And you have different kinds of decisions. There's a little less randomness as to what the attack cards that get put out against people are. Some of the randomness, maybe that's why these are added, is to add some randomness to the flavor of the thing, because these are special abilities that they also shorten the game, which may also be a factor in the multiplayer game. The components themselves are good. The counters are perfectly fine. I think you have plenty. Probably more than you need for a 4-player game. But what they may have found is some edge cases, 3 counter sheets wasn't enough. The cards, look, they're fantastic. You know, I can't get over where cards have gone. You know, in terms of for kind of a niche game that's not going to be a huge publication run, like cards are, or some of the Parker Brothers stuff and Milton Bradley and whatever, they could put out millions of copies so they could afford to put real poker quality cards. What's out there now is just great, but in terms of what's presented on them, there are a couple of things that I kind of feel iffy about. One is, first of all, there's the icons themselves. But these little locks, they're easy to miss in some cases. There's some of the icons that are a little too tiny because they're trying to fit so much information into just the icons. And that's probably about it in terms of what I had difficulty with. Since you hand the other player these red cards in the 2-player game, I do find it this is kind of weird because here they look like they have the same image on the bottom. But I felt like with another deck, I don't remember which one. Well, I do remember which one. I don't know if I can find it. This one, it's the same image. I feel like with the American Revolution, it didn't have the Revolutionary flag on the bottom of the attack cards. I don't know what it had. It may have had a paler version of it or something, but there was something definitely different. The space one, that's the same image on both. Maybe I'm just going to be proven wrong here, because I definitely felt like, it's hard to get these out. Okay, so the American Revolution ones have an American flag here, and then they do on the red too. I don't know what bee got into my bonnet there. I thought they had different images on them, and that was kind of problematic. One thing that's kind of sad, but you can understand why, I can't get a whole bunch of decks into here. I can squeeze in maybe 4 of these decks, no, 5 of these decks, and get a total of 9 decks in here. If I took the divider out, I still don't think I could get the full set in. And then there's also the case that I need room for this stuff. And that's kind of a sad little thing. I don't know. Got most of them in. I would suggest buying no more than 5 bonus decks to begin with, if that bothers you too much. But yeah, I found the multiplayer game just had too much going on and felt too heavy for the kind of play that I was getting out of and enjoyment that I was getting out of the 2-player game. And that's kind of an issue. Now, I say I don't respect this game very much because it doesn't do any of the things that I kind of look at and say, doesn't do this, doesn't do that, doesn't do that. What this game kind of does is it gives you, to me, an amusing platform or whatever that you can, kind of distract yourself for a while with. And it may become, there may be enough variation that it could keep you distracted for quite a while, if it becomes kind of addictive. And the play is simple enough, and in the 2-player game it doesn't take up that much space that I could see it takes up more than Magic does, but not by a hell of a lot. I and not some Magic decks, of course, will take up a lot more. Some are designed to be stupid, but but for the normal Magic decks that I was used to, it probably takes up a little bit more space. So it doesn't feel like it has a huge footprint in the two-player game. I felt like my big conference table wasn't enough for the four-player game. It was too tight, or barely able to handle it, which doesn't feel good to me. Because again, each player's tableau is bigger than each Magic player's tableau, and so yeah. It does allow in the multiplayer game for you to kind of, well, you could call it king making or whatever. I call it shooting the leader. It gives you actually a nice capability for that. And that's one of the things that's kind of wrong in the two-player game, is that, first of all, if the decks are unbalanced, and my impression was that they were, but that was because I made mistakes, and now I'm not so sure. Given the sheets in the rule book for tracking your wins and losses, that the values with each deck, I get kind of the feeling that that feels almost like a playtest type tool that got included for some reason. I get the feeling that a fair amount of effort was made to make sure that the decks were relatively well balanced and that you didn't see runaway pair-ups. I saw one, but again, I made mistakes, and also I think I got, according to the designer, I got kind of an odd situation. But there is a fair amount of luck, and maybe specifically with certain decks, where one card coming out or not coming out could make a huge difference to you. And because you don't control your hand particularly, you get a pile of cards, and you decide sight unseen where to put them. And some of them end up in your hand, and they may or may not be useful. There's a fair capability for you to just be jumbled all over the place. Now, I don't mind that one bit. I'm okay with that. I know some people don't like a lot of luck of that nature in a game. They want it to be a little bit more controlled. But yeah. I'm left with kind of a weird situation with this, because it doesn't provide what I think is a particularly powerful range of strategic decision making or something. Once you know the deck combination you're facing, you more or less, you can just kind of write that down and have a book on it and play that way. It'll get modified a little bit by circumstances, but not much. And outside of that, it's really just kind of a randomness and a luck type thing. Now, you could argue Bridge is kind of the same way, that there's a book on it essentially, but it's so big and so complex. I don't feel like this has that level of complexity. And then I do think the multiplayer game is richer. First of all, instead of what do you have, 11 decks or something like that? Let me see. 6, 11, 15 decks. Instead of like, how many pairs of decks can you take out of 15? You're getting how many sets of 3 or 4 decks can you take out of those 15, which in and of itself is a larger number, I think. My combinatorics are dying now, but it also doesn't really take into account it's not the only factor in play, because there's also the interaction of the players within those decks. So if somebody's getting ahead, you have that capability to bring them down. In the two-player game, if somebody's getting ahead, yeah, you've got things you can do against them, but you don't have allies to help you shoot that leader down. Yeah, it's a funny situation, because I think I would really enjoy playing this opposed in the two-player version. And after I played it enough in the two-player version, and that would be a fair amount, I would be comfortable playing it in the multiplayer version, I think. Because I would get more comfortable with the icons and with the sequence of play and the way things work and everything. But there's something clunky to the learning of all of that, and to coping with the fact that, like, you have to calculate each player order. And by the way, I needed to add dice to indicate, who was first, second, third, fourth in the four-player multiplayer game that I screwed up. You don't have to do anything like that in the two-player game. You just have to keep track of whose turn it is, because they just alternate back and forth. It feels solid, but not spectacular to me. The one thing people mention as the big innovation to it is this idea of paying cards into your piles, sight unseen. You do a lot of your play without knowing what your hand is. I don't know. I certainly haven't seen anything that does it in exactly this way, but I've seen things that allow you to take less cards for an effect, or pay resources to get extra cards, or something like that. And it's not far from that. Like, if you're saying, look, I'm taking a -2 card token to be able to do something as a penalty. Well, you don't know what those 2 cards are. It's the same effect, even if the mechanical aspect isn't quite the same. So, it's an innovative way of representing that same thing, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I did find it interesting. If you're looking for something, especially in that two-player life of a game, that's just kind of light and you can play, and maybe you'll get hooked into it, and maybe you'll start finding strategy or something more to it than I was able to, beyond just rules of thumb, well, it might be worth a shot. It really might, because I did find it to be an enjoyable game to play when I wasn't fucking up. Anyway, that's all we're going to do so that I don't have to compile, I don't know, a video out of pieces.